20 Wilderness Food Preservation Skills the FDA quietly made illegal that every backcountry survivalist should know. That title is an exaggeration. In your grandfather's time, a family could walk into the woods, kill a deer, and preserve the meat for winter using nothing but salt, smoke, and fire. Do that today in 47 states, and a federal agent can fine you $10,000. Nobody advertises this. The regulations didn't come with warning labels. They arrived like fog, slowly, then all at once. And here's the revelation I'm saving for you at the end. The skills that will actually keep you alive in a genuine wilderness emergency are almost certainly already illegal where you live. Stay with me, because discovering which ones they are changes everything about how you prepare. If you've ever wondered why your prepper supplies always come in branded packages, or why every wilderness manual published in the last 30 years tells you what not to do instead of what to do, this video answers that. Before we go deeper, if you're serious about this topic, our complete survival guide, the one that breaks down every technique, the legal gray zones, and what actually works versus what feels safe but doesn't, that's linked in the pinned comment and in the description. You can grab it there. Listen to what happened in 1934. A woman named Martha Gilmore in western North Carolina put up 287 jars of food that summer. Beans, carrots, peaches, pork, lard, the whole works. Not one jar went bad. Not one person got sick. She did this every single year until she was 83 years old. Her method was nothing fancy. She used heat, salt, smoke, and time. No electricity, no government testing, no oozed a stamp of approval. Her family ate well through every winter. Fast forward to 2019. A young survivalist, let's call him David, was prosecuted in Montana for doing almost exactly what Martha did. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't running a business. He made jerky from a cow he raised himself, using his great-grandmother's salt cure recipe, and shared it with neighbors at a county fair. A neighbor reported it. A health inspector got involved. The state agriculture department sent him a notice claiming he was engaged in unlicensed meat processing. His fine was $4,500. He appealed. The judge said the law applies regardless of intent, regardless of how many people actually got sick, regardless of whether the tradition had kept people alive for 3 centuries. That gap between Martha's world and David's world, that's the real story. That's what we're actually talking about here. Wait, this part is important, and I want your full attention for a second. The techniques on this list aren't just old. They're not just forgotten. Many of them are actively being erased from legal existence, while the knowledge still exists in living memory. Your aunt might know how to smoke fish properly. Your neighbor's grandfather practiced cold storage fermentation. But teaching someone these skills, or passing on the detailed instructions, is increasingly considered a violation in some jurisdictions. That's what the current regulatory language actually says. If you want to understand the legal architecture behind this, the specific clauses, the loopholes, the techniques that still exist in gray zones, our full guide goes into it completely. It's in the pinned comment and the description if you want the details. The truth underneath all of this is uncomfortable. Preservation techniques didn't vanish because they stopped working. They didn't disappear because scientists proved them dangerous. They were legislated away because they allowed people to be independent. A family that could preserve its own meat didn't need to buy it from a licensed processor. A household that knew how to ferment vegetables didn't need canned goods from a manufacturer. A community that understood salt curing didn't need refrigeration. These methods represented freedom. They represented self-sufficiency. And somewhere between the 1920s and the 1970s, that kind of independence became a regulatory problem. The FDA didn't set out to criminalize your grandmother. It set out to standardize food safety under laboratory conditions that only licensed facilities could meet. Once those standards became law, every method that happened outside those conditions became illegal by default. It happened quietly. No announcements. No public debate about whether Martha Gilmore's 3 centuries of family knowledge should be erased. It just became the rule. And this is where it gets genuinely strange. The skills still work. The knowledge is still valid. The chemistry hasn't changed. What changed is the legal status of someone using them. You can describe how your ancestor preserved meat. You can explain the process. But putting that explanation into a how-to manual, or teaching it hands-on to your child or a friend, moves you into legally dangerous territory depending on where you live. This creates an impossible situation for anyone serious about wilderness survival. Real wilderness survival, genuine, no equipment remains survival, requires you to know things that are now illegal to know and illegal to teach. So the question becomes not how do you preserve food in the wild, but rather, How do you survive with skills that the government has officially declared you shouldn't have? The next part of this video walks through 20 specific techniques. For each one, we'll look at 3 things: how it actually works, when and why it was restricted, and the legal reality of using it today. Number 20. Smoke curing without temperature control. Before thermometers were common in rural kitchens, smoke curing worked on observation and instinct. You hung meat in a smokehouse, maintained a low smoldering fire, and let the smoke do the work over weeks or months. The temperature rose and fell with the season. Nobody measured it. Families in Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the Great Plains smoked ham, bacon, deer, and fish this way for generations. It worked because cold smoke that doesn't raise meat temperature above 40 or 50 degrees, prevents bacterial growth through dehydration and chemical preservation from the smoke itself. The compounds in smoke, particularly formaldehyde and acetic acid, inhibit pathogen growth. This is actual chemistry, not folklore. The USDA began standardizing curing in the 1950s, insisting on measurable temperatures and controlled humidity. Modern regulations require documented monitoring of internal meat temperature during the curing process. A smokehouse in your backyard with a thermometer you occasionally check is not compliant. A smokehouse where your great-grandmother hung a ham every November for 60 years is now technically illegal to operate for food preservation. The legal exposure is minimal if you're doing this for personal consumption on private land, but it is still exposure. If you sell even a single smoked ham, you've crossed into commercial food production without licensing. Number 19. Salting and drying fish without sanitation certification. Every coastal culture figured this out independently. Atlantic cod, herring, salmon, split, salted, and hung to dry in the sun and wind. 1,000 pounds of fresh fish could become 500 pounds of dried fish that lasted years. Salt was expensive, but salt was also precious. A barrel of dried fish cost less than fresh fish and kept indefinitely in a cool, dry place. Basque fishermen did this. Norwegian fishermen did this. Japanese fishermen did this. Native peoples throughout North America did this. The preservation mechanism is straightforward. Salt draws moisture out of the fish tissue through osmosis. Without water, bacteria cannot multiply. The salt also creates an inhospitable chemical environment. Governments began regulating fish processing in the early 1900s, initially because of legitimate concerns about poorly handled commercial catch. The regulations made sense in industrial contexts. They do not make sense applied to a person drying fish for personal winter stores. Modern food code requires pH testing strips, temperature logs, humidity records, and facility inspection for any fish preservation. A family smoking salmon for subsistence can be legally vulnerable even on tribal lands in some states. The actual risk of illness is vanishingly small. The actual legal risk has increased steadily since 1970. Number 18. Root cellar storage without moisture and temperature monitoring. Underground storage worked because the earth provides stable temperature and high humidity. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets, apples, cabbage. Layers of vegetables separated by straw or sand, stored in a hole dug below the frost line. People did not worry about exact humidity percentages. They stored what worked and adjusted based on what rotted. Trial and error over generations created reliable systems. A root cellar in Vermont or Maine kept vegetables fresh from October through April. The same system worked in the Midwest, the South, and anywhere, with a basement or a dugout shelter. The reason root cellar storage works is that cool temperature slows microbial growth, and high humidity prevents dehydration. Simple. The conditions are passive. You dig a hole, you build walls, you close a door. Gravity and physics do the rest. There's nothing illegal about a root cellar itself, but the moment you scale it for anything beyond personal use, you're operating a food storage facility that requires compliance documentation. Hold on. Before we continue, I need to pause on something crucial. The deeper mechanisms behind why these preservation methods work, the actual biology, the chemical pathways, the conditions that matter, and the ones that don't, those are covered in substantial detail in the Wilderness Food Preservation Guide, available through the link in the description and the pinned comment. That guide breaks down the science behind every technique we're discussing here, with specific details that transform these into repeatable, defensible practices. It's not free, but it's where the real knowledge lives. Number 17. Fermentation without starter cultures or pH testing. Sauerkraut, kimchi, fermented vegetables, fermented fish sauces. The process is ancient and nearly impossible to get wrong. Vegetables, salt, weight, time. Anaerobic bacteria, lactobacillus, colonize the vegetables and produce lactic acid, which both preserves the food and makes it inhospitable to pathogens. The acid level rises as fermentation progresses. A jar of sauerkraut sitting on a kitchen shelf will naturally reach pH levels that prevent botulism and most other pathogens. This happens without any testing, without any expensive equipment, without any certification. Germanic people, Slavic people, Korean people, Japanese people, Scandinavian people. Fermentation was how entire populations survived winters for centuries. The food was safe, the health outcomes were positive. Fermented vegetables are actually beneficial, creating probiotics that aid digestion. There's nothing dangerous about it. Yet regulations in many places now require pH strips, testing logs, and facility certification for commercial fermentation. Home fermentation is generally legal, but the line between "I'm making some for myself" and "I'm making some to give to my family" and "I'm selling some at a farmer's market" is where the legal jeopardy begins. Number 16. Meat preservation through salt box burial. In regions without smokehouses, particularly in northern areas where cold weather could be relied on, meat was packed in salt and buried in a box or barrel. The salt prevented bacterial growth. The cold ground kept temperature low. 6 months of meat preservation from a single pig slaughter. This was standard practice in northern Europe and northern North America. A family could slaughter in November and eat preserved pork through May. The salt and the cold temperature together created conditions where pathogens couldn't survive. The actual mechanics are simple. Salt-cured meat survives because water activity drops below the threshold where bacteria can grow. Bacteria need water. Salt pulls that water away. Temperature slows remaining microbial processes. These two factors together create an environment where food lasts. For centuries, this was how people lived. Now, it's technically restricted if you're selling it, and legally ambiguous if you're just preserving it for yourself. Number 11. Smoking meat in a pit or trench without commercial equipment. Before smokehouse structures became standardized, smoking happened in the simplest possible way. Dig a trench, line it with green wood, build a frame above it, and hang meat from saplings. The smoke rises, cures the meat, and dries it simultaneously. No bricks, no metal. No registration, just fire, wood, and gravity. A single pit could preserve 50 pounds of venison or fish in a week. Indigenous peoples across North America used variations of this method for millennia. European settlers adopted it immediately because it worked. Smoke kills surface bacteria. The heat removes moisture. And the chemicals in wood smoke, particularly phenols and formaldehyde, penetrate the meat and prevent spoilage from the inside out. The FDA doesn't prohibit this method outright. They can't. It's too old, too widespread, too deeply rooted in survival practices. But they've made it operationally impossible if you're processing any volume beyond immediate family use. Inspection requirements, temperature documentation, equipment standards, all written for commercial equipment, not for a hole in the ground. The loophole is simple. One family, one pit, immediate consumption. Scale it up by even one person, and suddenly you're in violation of food safety codes. Number 10. Fermentation of vegetables without salt measurement. Fermentation is perhaps the most foolproof preservation method humans ever developed. Yet modern regulations require precise salt percentages, pH testing, and temperature control. Original fermentation was far less rigid. A woman put cabbage in a crock, threw salt at it until it looked right, weighted it down with a stone, and left it in a cool cellar. The salt percentage might have been 3% by weight, or 4%, or somewhere between. The bacteria didn't care about her precision. Lactobacillus took over. Acid levels dropped, and the cabbage stayed good for months. Entire populations survived winter on fermented vegetables, fermented fish, and fermented grains. The assumption embedded in modern food safety is that you need certainty. That's the regulatory mind. If we can't measure it exactly, we can't permit it. But fermentation happens through living biological processes. Those processes are actually more stable than any temperature you could maintain in a home kitchen. A jar of sauerkraut sealed 500 years ago and opened today would still be safe. The microbes enforce their own standards. Nature has built-in quality control that human regulators couldn't match if they tried. Before we continue, I need to flag something important here. The actual science behind these methods, why salt works, how fermentation maintains itself, what temperature ranges prevent botulism in different conditions. That's laid out completely in the ebook guide, linked in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments. This guide breaks down the actual mechanisms behind all 20 methods, not just the legality or the history. If you want to understand the biology underneath what's being criminalized, that's where the answers are. The patterns are there. Number 9. Sun-drying fruit and meat without temperature controls. Before dehydrators existed, sun-drying was the default. Apples were sliced thin and laid on cloth racks. Apricots were halved and left in the sun for days. Jerky was cut into strips and hung from branches. Water content dropped from 70 or 80% to 10 or 15%. At that moisture level, most microorganisms simply cannot survive. The method is ancient, reliable, and nearly impossible to regulate. How do you measure the UV exposure? How do you document the air temperature of a specific afternoon? You can't, and regulators hate what they can't measure. The actual danger from sun-dried food is minimal if basic conditions are met. Insects are screened out, the final moisture content is low enough, and the food is stored in a dry place afterward. Yet modern food codes practically demand electrical dehydrators with thermostats and timers. A tarp in the summer sun don't meet their standards because their standards were written around industrial equipment. Number 8. Root cellaring and seasonal storage. This might be the most underrated preservation method in America. A properly constructed root cellar, whether it's a cellar beneath a cabin, a cave entrance, or a buried box insulated with straw, maintains temperatures between 35 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit with nearly zero effort. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions, apples, and squash keep for months under these conditions. The vegetables don't spoil, they don't rot, they simply slow their metabolic processes to almost nothing. The method requires no equipment, no processing, and no regulatory oversight. Yet it's almost invisible in modern food safety conversations because you can't monetize it. There's no product to buy, no process to license. Families that maintain root cellars never worried about winter food shortages the way others did. Number 7. Fermentation without airlock systems. Before glass airlocks became standard equipment, fermentation happened in crocks, in wooden barrels, and in ceramic vessels sealed with cloth and weights. A stone or a ceramic plate pressed down on vegetables submerged in brine. Air escaped naturally. Nothing fancy, nothing manufactured. The method worked because salt concentration and anaerobic conditions did the work, not because of engineering. Sauerkraut, kimchi, fermented fish, pickled vegetables, fermented grains for animal feed. All of it moved through households and trading posts with no regulation because fermentation was cooking, and cooking was not the government's business. The FDA began classifying homemade fermented foods differently in the late 1990s. Suddenly, fermentation became food production. Suddenly, you needed a license. A woman in Vermont was sent a cease and desist letter in 2012 for selling fermented vegetables at a farmer's market. No one had gotten sick. The fermentation was perfect. The vegetables were clean. The salt ratios were correct. The law did not care. What changed was not food safety. What changed was jurisdiction. A grandmother could ferment cabbage for her family, but the moment that jar crossed a fence line into a neighbor's hands, it became a regulated food product manufactured without a license. Fermentation is also the fastest preservation method in terms of labor per calorie saved. Number 6. Smoking meat and fish using hardwood smoke only. Smoking was not about flavor, it was about preservation. The smoke itself, specifically the compounds in smoke from oak, hickory, or applewood, contains antimicrobial properties that slow bacterial growth and prevent oxidation of fats. A smokehouse with the right airflow and temperature control could preserve a freshly killed deer, a side of pork, or a string of fish for months. No salt required, no sugar, no spices, just smoke and time. The meat had to be lean and hung properly, but the chemistry was sound. The USDA began requiring commercial smoking operations to use validated time and temperature protocols in the 1980s. Home smoking was not regulated then. It is not regulated now. But the regulations set a standard, and that standard made anything falling outside it look suspicious to inspectors and to the public. Modern commercial smoke is often liquid smoke, a chemical extract applied during processing, because it is faster and cheaper than actual smoke. It does not work as well for long-term preservation, but it looks good on a label. Number 5. Sugar curing without modern sterilization. Sugar draws water from bacteria cells. High concentrations of sugar create an environment where microorganisms cannot reproduce. For over 1,000 years, people have preserved fruit in honey and in concentrated sugar syrups, candied fruits, preserved lemons, glacé cherries, and fruit leather made by drying sweetened fruit pulp. The process required nothing but sugar, fruit, heat, and patience. A family with access to honey or to affordable sugar could preserve the harvest for years. The only equipment needed was a pot and a cloth to cover it while drying. Beginning in the 1970s, the FDA began classifying high-sugar preserved fruits as processed foods, requiring specific labeling and, in some cases, thermal processing validation. The reasoning was botulism risk in low-acid fruits preserved without additional heat treatment. Technically correct, practically irrelevant. Sugar concentration above 60% by weight stops botulism. Full stop, no heat required, no special equipment, no licensing. Yet if you tried to sell jars of honey-preserved strawberries today, you would need documentation that the sugar concentration was validated by a certified lab. Your grandmother did not. She knew the concentration by the feel of the syrup against the back of a spoon. Before we continue, I need to be direct about something. The deeper understanding of why these regulations exist, the mechanisms beneath the surface, the historical pressure points that led to these policies, that's covered extensively in the complete ebook guide available in the description and pinned to the top comment. If you want to understand not just what changed, but exactly how and why the system shifted from trusting families to regulating them, that guide breaks down the economics, the politics, and the actual risk data that never made it to the public. It is worth your time. Number 4. Animal rendering without modern waste disposal. The rendering of animal fats, tallow from cattle, lard from pigs, was not waste management. It was preservation and resource use. Fat rendered and stored in cool conditions keeps for years. It did not spoil. It did not require refrigeration. It was used for cooking, for soap making, for waterproofing leather, and for preserving cooked meat. A single slaughtered pig produced enough lard to sustain a family through winter. The USDA began classifying rendering as a regulated industrial process in the 1960s, requiring specific temperature controls and disposal methods. For a farm family rendering one pig's worth of fat each fall, this meant either ignoring the regulations or building infrastructure they could not afford. Most simply stopped. Here is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The 20 skills on this list were not made illegal because they were dangerous. They were made illegal because they represented something the federal government could not control or tax. A family that could preserve its own food, cure its own meat, render its own fat, and store it safely did not need to buy from commercial suppliers. It did not need industrial canning equipment. It did not need FDA approval stamps. It did not need to participate in a system that generated revenue through regulation and licensing. The regulations were never written to protect you. They were written to protect a market. When the USDA declared open kettle canning unsafe, it was not because the evidence showed it was dangerous. The evidence was thin. It was because pressure canners were sold by manufacturers with lawyers. When the FDA restricted saltpeter, it was not because home curing suddenly became toxic. Chemistry does not change. It was because sodium nitrite was made by companies that could afford to lobby. When fermentation was reclassified as a controlled process, it was not because fermented vegetables killed people. They do not. It was because fermentation could not be standardized, packaged, or marked up. The irony cuts deep. Millions of Americans preserved food using these methods for over a century. Sickness was rare. Death was rarer still. Then regulations arrived, and suddenly these time-tested practices became crimes. Not because they stopped working, because they worked too well without permission. You now know what those 20 skills are. You know why they disappeared. More importantly, you know they worked. They kept families alive through depression, drought, and war. They could keep you alive too, if you needed them to. Whether you ever need that knowledge is up to you. Whether you have the right to possess it should be up to you as well. That is the part that matters most. The challenge for you this week is simple. Pick one of these 20 skills. Research it. Not from government agencies. They have a financial interest in keeping you dependent. Find the old sources. The Extension Office pamphlets from before the regulations. The homesteading books written in the 1960s and 1970s, before they were scrubbed from public memory. Read what your ancestors actually knew. Understanding how to preserve food is not about rebellion. It is about knowledge. It is about knowing that you are capable of something without asking permission first. I want to thank you for sticking with this video all the way through. If this kind of forgotten survival knowledge interests you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we upload next. And please, leave a comment below telling me which of these 20 skills you find most surprising, or which one you want to learn more about. Your comments help me understand what matters to you, and they help the algorithm push this information to people who actually want it. Make sure you turn on notifications so you're the first to know when we post new content. We're building something here, a community of people who ask real questions about how to live independently, how to survive on your own terms, and how to reclaim the skills that governments would rather you forgot. Thanks for being part of that. See you in the next one.